Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a bit of a shortcut through some pretty complex, maybe even unsettling territory.
That's right. We're looking at Spiritism, specifically through the lens of René Guénon's critique in the Spiritist Fallacy.
And if you're here, you probably want to get your head around these big ideas without wading through, well, everything. That's the plan.
Think of it as your guided tour into a movement that had a huge impact back in the day. And you can still feel its ripples, really.
What makes Guénon interesting here, I think, is that he's not just giving a history lesson.
No, not at all. He's coming at it as a metaphysician. He's digging into the core assumptions, the very foundation of Spiritism.
So forget the usual spooky seance image for a second. We're going deeper.
Much deeper. Into the logic, or as Guénon saw it, the lack of logic behind it all.
Exactly. So our mission, if you like, is to pull out the key bits of Guénon's analysis from his book. What did he think Spiritism was? Where did it come from? And why call it a fallacy?
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Guénon's definition.
Right. How did he pin it down?
Well, he gives a very specific one. It's the belief that you can communicate with the spirits of the dead.
Okay.
But crucially, these spirits are seen as keeping their individual human traits, their personality, memories, all supposedly held together by something he calls the Paris spirit.
So basically, they're just people without bodies. You could chat with your grandma and she'd still be your grandma.
That's the core idea, yeah. But Guénon jumps on that immediately.
He wasn't convinced.
Not even close. He argues that this whole concept, this specific way of thinking about talking to the dead, is actually quite new, a modern thing.
Oh, interesting. So not something you'd find in, say, ancient texts.
His point is that older ways of thinking about interacting with the deceased or whatever entities might be involved were completely different. This modern definition is key to understanding why Spiritism is, well, Spiritism.
Okay, so if it's modern, where did it kick off? What were the flashpoints Guénon identified?
He really points to Hydesville, New York, 1848, the Fox sisters.
Ah, the famous rappings.
Exactly, attributed to the spirit of a Charles B. Rosna, and he highlights Isaac Post's role too.
Post was the one who came up with the code, right? The spiritual telegraph.
Yeah, figuring out how to translate the raps into letters. A ghostly Morse code, essentially.
And this caught on.
Like wildfire. Suddenly, mediums started popping up everywhere claiming they could do the same thing. It became a huge public sensation.
But Guénon says this kind of thing wasn't totally new.
Right. He's careful to point that out. He mentions earlier cases like a rapping ghost back in Dippelsdorf in 1762, or the phenomena around Madame Haff, the seer of Prevorst that Dr. Kerner wrote about.
So these things happened before. Why did it explode in 1848? That's Guénon's question, isn't it?
Precisely. He asks, why then? Were there other factors involved? Maybe something more organized.
Like what? Secret societies.
He does float that idea. He talks about how there was interest in evocations in 18th century Germany, people like Schröpfer, but he stresses that's different from Spiritism, more like active magic, trying to command forces, not just passively receive messages.
Okay.
But then he does mention the possibility of groups like the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, maybe having a hand in it. Nudging it along, perhaps.
Guiding the movement from behind the scenes.
Or at least providing an initial push. He even brings up Annie Besant's ideas about souls of the dead serving adepts, though Guénon has his own spin on what that might really mean. The core point is, he doubts it was purely spontaneous.
So not just a random outbreak of spiritual interest, maybe a cultivated environment.
That seems to be his suspicion. He thinks it's unlikely something this big just happened on its own. An impulse, as he puts it, was probably needed, especially since similar phenomena before hadn't created such a widespread movement.
Okay, so America gets the ball rolling, but the actual term Spiritism comes from France.
That's right. And Guénon sees some key differences in how it developed there, mainly under Allan Kardec.
Kardec is the big name in French Spiritism.
Huge. And while the phenomena were similar, table tipping, messages, etc., Kardec built this whole theoretical system around it, which wasn't quite the same as the Anglo-American spiritualism.
And Guénon noticed something about the messages coming through in France.
Yeah, he points out how the spirit communications often seem to conveniently align with the opinions already floating around in Spiritist circles at the time.
So the spirits were surprisingly up to date on current French social issues.
Pretty much. Almost like they were echoing the zeitgeist rather than offering truly transcendent wisdom.
That does sound a bit suspicious. Didn't another famous medium criticize Kardec for this?
Yes, Douglas Home, a really well-known English medium, he wasn't a fan of Kardec's approach.
What was his beef?
Home basically accused Kardec of putting his own ideas into the mouths or raps of the spirits, kind of coaching the mediums, consciously or not.
Projecting his own philosophy onto the phenomena.
Exactly. Home famously asked how ancient figures like Iamblichus could suddenly be speaking perfect 19th century French through some medium. It raises big questions about who's actually doing the talking.
That's a great point, and Guénon uses that example of Bernard Palissy, the artist.
Oh yeah, the Palissy example is classic Guénon. Supposedly, Palissy's spirit was guiding a medium's art.
Including designs for Mozart's house on Jupiter.
Right. It perfectly illustrates Guénon's point about how these spiritual revelations often seem incredibly limited by, well, earthly contemporary imagination, not exactly cosmic truth.
And he felt this limitation extended to Spiritist literature in general.
Definitely. He generally found the intellectual level of Spiritist books, including Kardec's foundational texts, to be quite low.
Why low?
He partly attributes it to the collective nature of these circles. It's like groupthink. The ideas tend to regress to the lowest common denominator of the group involved.
Interesting. Not exactly tapping into higher wisdom, then.
Not in Guénon's view. He also flags the role of sentimentality. People wanted to believe, often for emotional reasons. He mentions Victor Hugo's conversion as an example where emotion perhaps trumped critical thinking.
And even scholars who got involved.
He notes that often even scientists or academics who studied these phenomena lacked the broader philosophical or metaphysical framework to really interpret them properly. Their expertise was too narrow.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit, Guénon hammers home this idea that Spiritism is modern, fundamentally modern. What's his argument there? Why isn't it just an old practice with a new name?
His core argument is that pre-modern cultures, whether ancient West, medieval West, or the East, had entirely different ways of understanding what a human being is and what happens after death.
Different metaphysics.
Totally different. Their views on things like magic, spirits, evocations were woven into a much bigger, more complex picture of reality. A picture largely lost in the modern West, according to Guénon.
So things like sorcery in the past weren't the same as Spiritism.
He'd say no. Sorcery might involve similar practices sometimes, dealing with lower-level forces, maybe leading to possession or obsession, which he might see as a kind of genuine, if dangerous, mediumship.
But the interpretation was different.
Fundamentally. Those older traditions had, a map of different levels of reality, different potential states after death. Spiritism, with its focus on Joe Bloggs just carrying on minus his body, was a radical simplification, a modern outlook.
And he connects this modern character to things like progress and democracy. How does that work?
Well, the Spiritist idea of individual spirits kind of climbing a ladder, progressing, mirrors the modern obsession with linear progress, right? Individual improvement.
Okay.
And its structure, lots of individual mediums, no central authority that kind of fits with democratic ideals, unlike the strict hierarchies you often find in traditional religions or esoteric groups.
Right. Now, he draws a line between Spiritism and occultism. People often lump them together, but Guénon sees them as distinct.
Very distinct in his analysis. Spiritism is primarily about talking to the dead. Simple, direct communication.
Okay. And occultism.
Occultism, for Guénon, is more about a body of hidden knowledge, esoteric teachings, practices aimed at maybe self-transformation or influencing unseen forces. It often has a more hierarchical structure, initiation, secret doctrines.
He mentions figures like Levi Blavatsky.
Right. Eliphas Levi, the Theosophical Society, Papus, and the French occult scene. He notes that sometimes occultism presented itself as a kind of neo-spiritualism, which just added to the confusion for outsiders.
And then there's psychism, or what we might call parapsychology today. Where does that fit?
Guénon sees psychism as this messy, potentially dangerous field dealing with forces that are just not well understood, hard to control, hard to study reliably.
Separate from both Spiritism and occultism.
Yeah, he distinguishes it. He criticizes researchers for getting bogged down in just observing phenomena, table turning, telepathy, whatever, without a solid theoretical basis. He calls it the superstition of phenomena.
Focusing on the what without the why or how.
Exactly. And he notes that the whole Spiritist environment influenced early psychical research. Some researchers, like Lombroso or Sir Oliver Lodge, even ended up adopting Spiritist explanations.
They got drawn in.
Guénon saw it as a risk of studying these things without the right metaphysical grounding. You focus on the weird stuff, the phenomena, and miss the deeper picture.
Okay, this is crucial then. If it's not spirits, How does Guénon explain the phenomena? He doesn't just say it's all fake, right?
No, he acknowledges that something happens, but he rejects the spirit explanation. He mentions Dr. Gibby categorizing theories. You've got the collective being idea, action of fluidic beings, spirits of the dead, and the one Guénon leans towards,
Which is?
the exterior reflection of the living. Basically, the phenomena are generated primarily by the medium themselves or the participant.
Coming from their own subconscious or something like that?
Yeah, precisely. The medium acts as a focal point, externalizing things from their own psyche or maybe picking up on thoughts and energies from the sitters. It's generated from within the living circle, not from outside. Discarnate entities.
He also mentions the occultist idea of elementaries.
Right, as another possible contributing factor. These are seen in occultism as sort of psychic remnants, shells, or perhaps very low-level entities, often linked to violent deaths or suicides, not conscious individuals in the spiritist sense.
And the collective being theory.
That idea suggests the phenomena arise from a kind of psychic pooling, the medium and the attendees combining their subtle energies, their fluids or paraspirits, to create effects.
So for physical things, like tables moving.
He suggests explanations like unconscious muscle movements, maybe subtle energy currents, what some called fluidic currents, for objects moving across rooms, maybe temporary changes in the state of matter, not necessarily a ghost picking it up.
The key takeaway seems to be, the source is probably closer to home than we think, within the living, not the dead.
That's Guénon's thrust, yes. Keep the explanation within the known, or at least potentially knowable realm of the living psyche and subtle energies, rather than invoking spirits.
What about materializations, though? That seems like the hardest thing to explain away. Seeing and touching a spirit.
Guénon tackles that with the ideoplastic theory. The idea is the medium produces some kind of substance ectoplasm which is then molded.
Molded by what?
By thought, by a mental image. It could be the medium's conscious or subconscious idea, or even an image strongly held by someone else in the room. The ectoplasm takes the shape of the idea.
So it looks like Uncle Bob, because someone is thinking strongly of Uncle Bob.
That's the theory. It doesn't require Uncle Bob's actual spirit to be involved at all. And Guénon is quick to point out how many materializations were proven fraudulent, or simply replicated known photographs or drawings.
And verifying identity is almost impossible anyway.
Fundamentally difficult, yes. Even if something appears, how do you prove it's who or what it claims to be? Guénon found the evidence profoundly lacking.
Okay, so Guénon sees these flawed explanations. But he also points out that the Spiritist movement itself wasn't exactly a united front, was it?
Oh, far from it. He really emphasizes the lack of cohesion. Different schools, different leaders, all claiming slightly different things.
Contradictions everywhere.
Loads of them. Teachings attributed to superior spirits in one circle would directly contradict messages received in another. And lots of rivalry.
Mediums competing?
Yeah, groups claiming they had exclusive access to certain high-level spirits, dismissing other mediums as frauds or dealing with inferior entities. It was quite fragmented.
And the intellectual content of these superior messages.
Generally, Guénon found it pretty underwhelming, often banal, moralistic, or just reflecting contemporary ideas rather than profound spiritual insight. It didn't scream divine origin to him.
So kind of chaotic, despite having organization.
Exactly. You had these big associations and federations, especially later on, and even spiritist churches and secret societies in America, often with very grand titles.
But underneath it was still pretty messy.
Very messy. And the relationship with occultism was complicated too. Some spiritists dabbled in occult circles, some occultists looked down on spiritism. It was all quite fluid and often contradictory.
Let's talk about one of Spiritism's biggest draws, immortality. The promise of survival after death. How does Guénon pick that apart?
He finds the spiritist notion of survival pretty vague. It just seems to mean carrying on much like before in some ill-defined state.
Not a very rigorous definition of immortality.
Not at all. He contrasts it with, say, the occultist idea of a second death on the astral plane, which suggests that even if you survive physical death, that survival might itself be temporary.
So proving survival in a séance doesn't prove ultimate immortality.
Exactly. And then reincarnation throws another wrench in the works. If you're just going to be reborn, then survival is just a pit stop between lives, not immortality in any grand sense.